U.S. President Joe Biden has announced he is directing the U.S. military to build a temporary port on the Gaza coast. It will be used to deliver aid to the Palestinian territory. Biden outlined details of the plan in the final State of the Union address of his four-year presidency. He also pledged to keep on supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia and underlined the importance of the NATO military alliance. In a speech lasting over an hour and touching on multiple policies, Biden essentially made a pitch to American voters as he hopes to win a second term in office.
A high-stakes speech for U.S. President Joe Biden. His last State of the Union address before elections. With the U.S. Middle East policy under scrutiny, Biden announced American troops will build a temporary port on Gaza's coast to boost aid there. He also called on Israel to protect civilian lives.
For the leadership of Israel, I say this: humanitarian assistance cannot be a secondary consideration or a bargaining chip. Protecting and saving innocent lives has to be a priority. As we look to the future, the only real solution to the situation is a two-state solution over time.
Turning to the Ukraine war, Biden appealed to Congress to support the nation in defending itself against Russia. He lashed out at ex-President Donald Trump for encouraging Russia to invade NATO allies who didn't spend more on defense.
For the soul of our nation. Now my predecessor, a former Republican president, tells Putin, quote, "Do whatever the hell you want." That's a quote. A former president actually said that, bowing down to a Russian leader. I think it's outrageous, it's dangerous, and it's unacceptable.
America's oldest sitting president used the speech to address concerns about his age and whether or not he is fit for another term.
Whether young or old, I've always known what endures. I've known our North Star. The very idea of America is that we're all created equal and deserves to be treated equally throughout our lives. We've never fully lived up to that idea, but we've never walked away from it either. And I won't walk away from it now. I'm optimistic.
Republicans have criticized the address for being too political. But Biden supporters say it's proof that he can handle another 4 years in office.
I really am. I'm optimistic, Nancy.
And here's what he had to say about Israel and Gaza.
This war has taken a greater toll on innocent civilians than all previous wars in Gaza combined. More than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, most of whom are not Hamas. Thousands and thousands of innocents, women and children, girls and boys, also orphaned. Nearly 2 million more Palestinians under bombardment or displacement. Homes destroyed, neighborhoods in rubble, cities in ruin. Families without food, water, medicine. It's heartbreaking. The United States has been leading international efforts to get more humanitarian assistance to Gaza. Tonight, I'm directing the U.S. military to lead an emergency mission to establish a temporary pier in the Mediterranean on the coast of Gaza that can receive large shipments carrying food, water, medicine, and temporary shelters. No U.S. boots will be on the ground. A temporary pier will enable a massive increase in the amount of humanitarian assistance getting into Gaza every day.
All right, let's get more on this with DW reporter William Glucroft, who's one of DW's U.S. analysts. William, good morning. President Biden has been under pressure from his critics over his administration's handling of the war in Gaza. Does this announcement assuage those critics?
I would doubt it. I think the only thing that's going to assuage those critics is a ceasefire and doing humanitarian aid the old-fashioned way, the tried-and-true way, getting trucks in, which every humanitarian relief organization, the UN says, they're there. They're ready to go, and it's an effective way to get aid in. And Israel has been dragging its feet on that. And now we're going to Plan B, Plan C, these airdrops that we've seen the last few days, which experts in the field say is not an effective way to get aid in. And then a lot of questions about this pier. How is it really going to be built? How long is it going to take? How much aid can it really get in? Coordination with the Israeli military. It's a complicated situation. And as you say, it's probably not going to assuage critics because the fighting, it doesn't address the core issue of the fighting and the dying.
The core demand of the ceasefire,
Right.
that a lot of people, I think, were holding up placards as well, I think, inside the chamber. Let's just bring in DW correspondent Tanya Kramer, who joins us now from Jerusalem. Tanya, good morning to you as well. Has there been any reaction to this announcement from President Biden?
No, so far we haven't heard any reaction from Israeli officials, but we understand, for this to work, the security establishment here, security agents would have to be involved, of course, in all this process, potentially then in the screening process where those ships would leave the goods to Gaza. It's quite a remarkable announcement, though, because Gaza has a very small port, and which is located in northern Gaza, in Gaza City, in the Ramal area. That's the center of Gaza, and it has been reportedly heavily damaged now, of course, in the course of this war. And any attempt over the past 17 years or so to expand this port had been rejected by Israel after Hamas seized power there in Gaza. And fishermen, which were a very, very important trade in Gaza, they were only allowed to go up between 6 to 15 nautical miles. And then you had the Israeli Navy actually closing the area off, depending on the political situation. Now, we don't know yet the logistics of this. We don't know whether the pier, what has been talked about, would be in the area where the old port is. But all these questions are, how then these large ships would actually anchor in the area, and also how this aid would be distributed then on land.
Lots of unanswered questions at this point. But Tanya, does this announcement by President Biden also represent a total divergence with its ally Israel when it comes to the humanitarian situation in Gaza?
Well, I think it's seen here as, the United States, as you said, the closest ally of Israel, has some difficulties to pressure Israel on the issue of humanitarian aid. There has been some talk that another crossing, which is a crossing in the north, the Erez crossing, which was also, as we've been told here by officials, heavily damaged. But, humanitarians have said, this crossing needs to be open to have a direct way into northern Gaza. And as we said, the land distribution is still the optimal way of distributing aid into Gaza. But so far this hasn't happened, and the humanitarian community has resorted to this air dropping aid from planes. But all this is, of course, not enough to match the needs, especially in northern Gaza, where humanitarian organizations have warned of starvation and famine.
We'll leave that there for the moment. Tanya, thanks so much for joining us this morning. William, there's, of course, other issues that came up in the State of the Union that we would like to look at. And one of those issues was what the president had to say when it came to support for Ukraine. Let's just have a listen to what he had to say on that.
What makes our moment rare is that freedom and democracy are under attack both at home and overseas at the very same time. Overseas, Putin of Russia is on the march, invading Ukraine and sowing chaos throughout Europe and beyond. If anybody in this room thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine, I assure you he will not.
William, is that warning likely to bridge the bipartisan divide, the partisan divide that exists in Congress over funding for Ukraine? I think I'm talking about that $60 billion
Right, the magic
bill.
$60 billion
exactly,
that has been just hanging out there for months now.
How many months has it been?
I believe I was here talking about this, I think, in November it was. And it seemed like a foregone conclusion that at some point there'll be the normal wranglings where this money would go through. And now it's looking like it really might not. There is still support on both sides of the aisle for Ukraine. It is an election year, so any way to score points, to make sure the other side doesn't look good, is of course helpful for domestic politics, for people's individuals, campaign chances, especially for the president. And the Ukraine funding, it's not so much being against the Ukraine funding as what it's getting tied to, right? The immigration situation. And that's what's really being held up. I think if you just isolate the Ukraine situation on its own, you probably do find a lot of support on the Republican side, but it's getting lost in this cosmic radiation background of U.S. politics.
I mean, you say that, but it looks like we are now heading into a two-horse race, essentially, as we head into November. We're looking at Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, a rerun of the previous election. But even in his first term, Donald Trump was himself not too keen when it came to supporting Ukraine against Russia.
Donald Trump is an interesting case, as he is in many different aspects. He actually was the first U.S. president to approve lethal aid to Ukraine, sending Javelin missiles. Now, I don't want to overstate that commitment. There was a lot of conditions attached to that delivery, but he was the first president on record, we must say, to give lethal aid. There were other kinds of security assistance that the Obama administration delivered. But of course, then we know the much bigger story of tying security for Ukraine to his political whims back home. Exactly. That led to his impeachment. So that's the much bigger story. And that is what is at stake for Joe Biden right now, trying to make that case. He said, we will not, I'm paraphrasing, we will not let Ukraine fail. We will not leave Ukraine. And then he said, I will not. So that's his pitch to, if I am reelected, please reelect me because we need to stand by Ukraine.
But how much support is there in the American public to continue this funding support for Ukraine?
We're seeing war weariness in the polls. The war is dragging on 2 years. But what supporters of Ukraine will say, I was just talking to Ben Hodges, retired U.S. Army general, often on DW, and he was saying the problem is no clear strategy, no clear vision from people like Joe Biden. We're hearing support. He was very strong at the top of the State of the Union, talking about supporting Ukraine to stop Putin. But he won't actually clearly say what that means. And that's partly because of those red lines that Russia's put out when it comes to escalation and especially the question of nuclear weapons.
Another issue that has rankled Donald Trump in particular has been NATO. And Joe Biden was speaking about NATO in his State of the Union address as well. Let's just listen to what he had to say about that.
Now my predecessor, a former Republican president, tells Putin, quote, do whatever the hell you want. That's a quote. A former president actually said that, bowing down to a Russian leader. I think it's outrageous, it's dangerous, and it's unacceptable. America is a founding member of NATO, the military alliance of democratic nations, created after World War II to prevent war and keep the peace. And today, we've made NATO stronger than ever. We welcomed Finland to the alliance last year. And just this morning, Sweden officially joined, and their minister is here tonight. Come here, stand up. Welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And they know how to fight.
William, that ringing endorsement of NATO from Joe Biden, is that a sentiment that is a bipartisan sentiment? Yes
and no. The anti-NATO sentiment that we're hearing from Donald Trump is much stronger coming from Donald Trump than from the Republican Party. There is still bipartisan support for NATO and an understanding of the importance of the transatlantic relationship for U.S. security interests. But again, as I said, it's an election year. People are looking to score points and not make the other side look good, not give victories to the other side. So things are getting held up. And everything is about, in the Republican Party, everything is about Donald Trump. So what Donald Trump wants is what the Republican Party trends to, regardless of what other sentiment there might be in Congress. I don't think we should panic too much about NATO. Donald Trump cannot just snap his fingers and pull the United States out of NATO or bring NATO down. It is a treaty organization. There's a lot of legal aspects that Congress would have input in. There'd be massive challenges. We are a long way off from the simple demise of NATO, even if Donald Trump becomes president.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be a complete extreme action like that. I mean, could it not be the case that NATO loses its relevance for the United States under Donald Trump?
Well, they say necessity is the mother of innovation. We've seen a lot of renewed energy on the European side of the NATO alliance, saying we need to get our act together. We're seeing this in the European Union coming out, the European Commission having its plan for more coordinated defense planning, defense procurement at the European level to basically make up for any potential risk of the U.S. stepping back from its security commitments to Europe. So this could actually be a boon for European security and its commitment to NATO, not necessarily a demise.
A story to be continued nonetheless. William Glucroft, we will leave it there for the time being, but thanks so much for coming in this morning.
It's a pleasure.
Let's get more from Rachel Tausenfreund, editorial director at the German Marshall Fund. Mrs. Tausenfreund, President Biden touched on a number of issues in his speech. I'd like to talk about his endorsement of NATO first. Is that going to be reassuring for Europeans beyond November?
Sure. He touched on a lot of really important points that should reassure U.S. European allies and also Kiev. I mean, he opened the speech with Ukraine, which is a pretty unusual move. So he said a lot of the things that European allies want to hear, but perhaps more importantly, he also gave a feisty speech, an energetic speech that was a pretty successful campaign launch. And that's also reassuring to allies in Europe, since the polls haven't looked great for Biden in the past few months. So on both accounts, in terms of the messaging, he said what Europeans want to hear. He had the Prime Minister of Sweden there to sort of underscore U.S. commitment to NATO, and also his performance was strong and it was feisty.
Now, the EU recently passed a 50 billion euro aid package for Ukraine, but the U.S. Congress has failed to pass a similar amount for months now. Was there anything in the speech that sounded like a plan as to how President Biden would make that happen?
Unprecedented in the history of the Union.
No, there wasn't anything like a plan. There was just sort of public pressure. The really interesting thing about that part of the speech, though, is you have from the optics of it Mike Johnson, who's sitting right behind President Biden as he's delivering the speech. And it's Johnson who's not bringing the bill to the floor in the House. So it's basically Johnson who's blocking it. If the bill came to a vote, it would pass in the House. And yet Johnson was sort of nodding along with President Biden's messaging on Ukraine. So it was a very strange image. What the Europeans, though, can see from here, or U.S. allies in general, if you watch the chamber during that part of the speech, you see that that was probably the strongest bipartisan part of the speech. There's actually a lot of bipartisan support for the aid to Ukraine. It's just this very powerful minority in Congress that's still managed to block it. So there wasn't a plan. There can't really be a plan. It's congressional power in the end. But Biden underscored where he stands, and I think he's hoping that he will awaken a little bit more public pressure, and maybe that will push Congress to act.
President Biden also said that the U.S. would build a temporary port off Gaza to bring in aid via the sea. Is that an effort that European nations could be joining?
He didn't mention it explicitly, but I think it could be, something that other allies could join in with. And I mean, in general, there's a lot of international aid that's not getting into Gaza. So if the U.S. can build this pier, it certainly could then become an internationally used pier. He didn't mention it explicitly, but I think that will be seen certainly for a lot of allies in the Middle East as an important step.
We'll leave it there for the time being. Rachel Tausenfreund of the German Marshall Fund. Thank you so much.